The radio was crackling with static when Staff Sergeant Tommy "Voice" Callahan heard his twin brother's desperate transmission cut through the interference at 1,347 hours. Any Allied unit, this is Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion. We are surrounded and taking heavy casualties. German armor is closing in from 3 directions. We need immediate artillery support on coordinates 347 to 529 or we're all dead. Tommy's hands froze over the damaged radio equipment in the captured German bunker where he'd been holding position for 6 hours since his unit was overrun by a panzer assault. The radio had been declared inoperable by 3 different technicians, its antenna shot away and its power supply failing after taking a direct hit from German artillery. But Tommy could hear his brother Mike's voice clearly through the static, calling for the fire support that would save Charlie Company, or destroy them if the coordinates were wrong. The problem was simple and deadly. Tommy was the only radio operator in range with working equipment, but he was trapped in a German strongpoint that was exactly 200 yards from the coordinates Mike had requested for artillery bombardment. If Tommy called in the fire mission, the shells would fall directly on his own position, turning the bunker into his tomb. If he didn't call it in, his brother and 60 American soldiers would be slaughtered by German tanks within the next 15 minutes. What happened next would either save Mike's company and prove that brotherhood could overcome the fear of death, or it would demonstrate that some tactical situations have no good solutions when the only choice is between certain death and certain defeat. If stories of ultimate sacrifice and family loyalty move you, hit that subscribe button. These accounts show what a man will choose when saving his brother means accepting his own destruction. The German breakthrough that trapped both brothers began at 0630 hours on October 14, 1944, during the Allied push through the Hurtgen forest in western Germany. The 2nd Battalion had been advancing through dense woodland toward German defensive positions when a coordinated counterattack by the 6th Panzer Division struck their exposed flanks and split the American formation into isolated pockets of resistance. The attack came without warning from 3 directions simultaneously, as German tanks emerged from concealed positions in the forest and began methodically destroying American positions with devastating efficiency. The sound of Panzer engines and 88mm cannon fire echoed through the trees as American soldiers scrambled for cover and tried to establish defensive positions in terrain that favored the attacking armor. Staff Sergeant Tommy Callahan was the battalion's senior radio operator, responsible for maintaining communications between scattered units and coordinating artillery support for infantry advances through the heavily defended forest. Tommy had earned his nickname, Voice, by being able to maintain radio contact under impossible conditions, using damaged equipment and improvised antennas to keep American units connected when conventional communications failed. Tommy's expertise with radio equipment had developed during his childhood in Boston's Irish neighborhoods, where he had built crystal radios and experimented with amateur radio equipment in the basement of his family's 3-story tenement building. His father Patrick had encouraged Tommy's technical interests, understanding that his quiet, intelligent son had abilities that could serve him well in military service. Tommy's twin brother Mike was a platoon sergeant with Charlie Company, leading 37 soldiers in the spearhead assault that was supposed to break through German defenses and open a corridor for the main advance. Mike had inherited their father's physical presence and natural leadership abilities, but he had also learned to rely on Tommy's technical knowledge and problem-solving skills when facing complex tactical situations. The Callahan brothers had grown up in the close-knit Irish community of South Boston, where family loyalty was considered more important than individual success and where brothers were expected to protect each other against any threat. Their father Patrick had been a Boston police sergeant for 23 years, walking beats in neighborhoods where ethnic tensions and economic hardship created constant challenges that required both physical courage and diplomatic skill. Boys, Patrick had told Tommy and Mike throughout their childhood, in this world, family is all you got that you can count on absolutely. Friends come and go, jobs disappear, but blood is blood forever. Tommy, you got the brains to figure out problems that other people can't solve. Mike, you got the heart to lead men through situations that would break weaker people. Together, you're stronger than either one of you could ever be alone. The Callahan family had lived through the Great Depression by pooling their resources and supporting each other through the worst economic crisis in American history. Patrick's police salary had kept them housed and fed, but barely, and the boys had learned early that survival sometimes required sacrifice from family members who put the welfare of others ahead of their own comfort. Tommy and Mike had enlisted together on December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, walking into the Army recruitment office in downtown Boston with the determination to serve their country and the understanding that they would protect each other no matter what dangers they faced in military service. The Army had tried to separate them during training, assigning them to different specialties and different units, but the brothers had used every connection and favor they could find to arrange assignments that would keep them in the same theater of operations. Tommy's technical skills had made him valuable as a communications specialist, while Mike's leadership abilities had marked him for promotion to non-commissioned officer rank. "Boys," Patrick had told Tommy and Mike before they shipped out for Europe, "you got each other over there, and that's more than most soldiers have. Tommy, you keep those radios working and make sure Mike gets the support he needs. Mike, you keep your head down and remember that your brother's counting on you to come home safe." For 2 years, the brothers had operated as an unofficial team, with Tommy coordinating fire support for Mike's infantry assaults and Mike providing tactical intelligence that helped Tommy direct artillery with deadly precision. They had developed an intuitive understanding of each other's methods and a communication system that allowed them to coordinate complex operations with minimal radio traffic. But the German counterattack had shattered their careful coordination and separated the brothers for the first time since they'd arrived in Europe. Tommy found himself cut off in a captured German bunker with a damaged radio and no contact with American forces, while Mike's company was surrounded 3 miles away and fighting for their lives against overwhelming enemy armor. The bunker where Tommy was trapped had been part of the German defensive line before the American advance overran it 6 hours earlier. The position was strongly built with reinforced concrete walls and overhead cover that could withstand direct artillery hits, but it was also isolated and surrounded by German forces that were systematically hunting down isolated American soldiers. Tommy had been trying to repair his damaged radio equipment when he heard Mike's transmission, the first American voice he'd heard in hours of monitoring German radio traffic and listening to the distant sounds of tank engines and machine gun fire. The fact that he could hear Mike clearly meant his brother was close enough for direct radio contact, but it also meant Mike's unit was operating in the same area where German forces were conducting their counterattack. The coordinates Mike had requested for artillery support placed the target zone directly on top of the German strongpoint where Tommy was hidden. If Tommy called in the fire mission, American artillery would saturate the area with high explosive shells that would destroy German armor and infantry positions, along with anyone else who happened to be in the target zone. Tommy had perhaps 10 minutes to make a decision that would determine whether his brother lived or died, and whether he would ever see his family again. The impossible choice that defined brotherhood. Tommy's tactical situation was unprecedented in his 2 years of combat experience. He was a radio operator trapped alone in enemy territory with equipment that barely functioned, faced with a fire mission that would save his brother's life but certainly end his own. Military doctrine provided no guidance for situations where tactical success required the deliberate sacrifice of communication personnel. The radio equipment that Tommy was using had been damaged during the German artillery barrage that preceded their counterattack. The primary antenna had been severed by shrapnel from a near miss that had also damaged the radio's power supply and scrambled several of its frequency crystals. Tommy had spent 4 hours jury-rigging a replacement antenna using copper wire salvaged from German telephone lines and metal components stripped from destroyed American equipment. The SCR-300 radio set that Tommy was operating had been designed for reliable short-range communication under field conditions, but it had never been intended to function with the kind of improvised modifications that combat necessity had forced Tommy to implement. The damaged power supply was providing erratic voltage that caused the transmitter to fade in and out unpredictably, while the makeshift antenna was creating interference patterns that made reception difficult even under ideal conditions. But Tommy's childhood experience with amateur radio equipment had taught him techniques for maintaining communication with severely compromised equipment that weren't covered in standard Army technical manuals. He understood how to compensate for power fluctuations by adjusting transmitter gain manually, and he knew how to position improvised antennas to maximize signal strength while minimizing interference from nearby metal objects. The most challenging aspect of Tommy's technical situation was the precision required for artillery fire coordination. Military doctrine demanded that fire missions be transmitted with absolute clarity and verified through multiple repetitions to prevent friendly fire incidents that could destroy American units instead of enemy targets. But Tommy's damaged equipment made clear transmission difficult, and his isolated position made verification impossible. Tommy had been monitoring German radio traffic for several hours, using his technical knowledge to intercept enemy communications and gather intelligence about German troop movements and tactical plans. The German radio discipline was excellent, but Tommy had learned enough German during his technical training to understand basic military terminology and unit designations that provided valuable information about enemy strength and intentions. The bunker's German communication equipment was still partially functional, and Tommy had been able to use captured German radio sets to monitor multiple frequencies simultaneously while maintaining his primary American radio for emergency communication. This capability had made him one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the battalion, but it had also made his survival a high priority for both American and German forces. Tommy's knowledge of German radio procedures had allowed him to identify the frequency patterns used by German armor units, and he had been tracking the movement of the panzer elements that were now threatening Mike's company. The German tactical communications were professional and disciplined, but they revealed the methodical approach that German commanders were using to systematically destroy isolated American positions. The mathematics of Tommy's tactical situation were simple and terrifying. Mike's company was surrounded by German armor that was positioned in a semicircle around the captured bunker where Tommy was hiding. The only way to destroy the German tanks was with concentrated artillery fire that would saturate the entire area with high-explosive shells, including the bunker where Tommy had taken shelter. Tommy had calculated the blast radius of 155 mm artillery shells and knew that the bunker's reinforced concrete construction might provide enough protection to survive the bombardment if the German engineering was as thorough as their radio discipline. But survival would depend on factors beyond his control, including the accuracy of American artillery and the structural integrity of German defensive construction. Tommy began his preparations by carefully plotting the coordinates on his military map, using German maps captured in the bunker to verify the accuracy of Mike's position and the location of enemy forces. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. The German armor that was threatening Mike's company was positioned in a semicircle around the bunker where Tommy was hiding. The artillery fire mission would require a sustained bombardment lasting at least 5 minutes to ensure destruction of German armor and infantry. During those 5 minutes, the bunker would be subjected to direct hits from 155 mm howitzer shells that could penetrate reinforced concrete and collapse underground fortifications. Tommy's only hope for survival would be the structural integrity of the German bunker, which had been designed to withstand Allied artillery bombardment. But even if the bunker survived the direct hits, Tommy would be trapped underground with no communication equipment and no way to signal American forces that he was alive and needed rescue. Tommy checked his watch and realized he had been thinking for 4 minutes while Mike's company continued to fight for their lives against German armor that was closing in for the final assault. Tommy could hear the distinctive sound of panzer engines through the bunker's ventilation system, mixed with the sharp crack of tank guns and the rattle of machine gun fire that indicated the battle was reaching its climax. Tommy keyed his microphone and spoke the words that would save his brother's life and seal his own fate. "Fire Direction Center, this is radio operator Callahan. I have a priority fire mission, coordinates 347 to 529. German armor in the open, infantry in support. Request immediate fire for effect with high explosive. Adjust fire on my command." The response was immediate and professional. "Radio operator Callahan, this is Fire Direction Center. We copy coordinates 347 to 529, German armor in the open. Be advised, those coordinates are danger close to your last known position. Can you confirm target coordinates and your current location?" Tommy looked around the bunker that would become his tomb and keyed the microphone again. Fire Direction Center, coordinates are confirmed. I am in position to observe target and adjust fire. Request immediate fire for effect. There was a pause before the artillery controller responded, Roger, radio operator Callahan. Fire mission approved. Time of flight 45 seconds. Shot, over. Tommy had 45 seconds to live. The bombardment that saved everything. The first 155mm artillery shell landed at 1,352 hours with the impact of a small earthquake, shaking the bunker so violently that Tommy was thrown against the concrete wall hard enough to leave him stunned and disoriented. The explosion was followed immediately by 5 more shells that walked across the German positions in a devastating pattern that obliterated everything above ground within a 200-yard radius. The sound of the bombardment was unlike anything Tommy had experienced in 2 years of combat operations. Each shell impact created a pressure wave that passed through the concrete structure like a physical blow, followed by the metallic rain of shrapnel fragments that struck the bunker's exterior walls with the sound of a massive hailstorm. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered and died as the electrical system failed under the repeated shock waves. Tommy could hear the screaming of hot metal fragments as they ricocheted off the bunker's concrete walls, mixed with the deeper rumble of secondary explosions as German ammunition stores and fuel tanks were hit by the American artillery. The vibrations were so intense that dust and small pieces of concrete began falling from the ceiling, and Tommy could feel the entire structure shifting slightly under the repeated impacts. The German Panzer tank that had been positioned directly above the bunker was lifted off the ground by a direct hit and thrown sideways into a crater, its 25-ton mass hurled through the air like a toy before crashing back to earth in a twisted wreck. The impact was so violent that Tommy could feel the shock wave through the concrete floor, followed by a series of smaller explosions as the tank's ammunition cooked off and sent burning fragments across the forest floor. 2 other German tanks were destroyed by near misses that penetrated their side armor and caused internal fires that consumed everything inside the vehicles. The sound of exploding tank ammunition was distinctive and terrifying, a rapid series of sharp cracks followed by the whoosh of burning fuel and the metallic screech of turrets being blown off their mountings by internal explosions. But Tommy was still alive, protected by German engineering that had been designed to withstand exactly this type of concentrated artillery bombardment. The bunker had been constructed with 3 feet of reinforced concrete overhead and walls that were designed to absorb the impact of direct hits from Allied artillery. The steel reinforcement bars that ran through the concrete structure prevented catastrophic collapse even when individual sections were damaged by shell fragments. The bombardment continued for exactly 5 minutes, during which time 36 155mm shells fell within the target area that Tommy had designated. The mathematical precision of American artillery fire was devastating in its effectiveness, creating a pattern of destruction that eliminated every German vehicle and position within the designated coordinates while leaving the underground bunker intact but sealed. Tommy's radio equipment had been completely destroyed by the concussion, the delicate electronic components shattered by shock waves that passed through the concrete structure despite its protective capabilities. Vacuum tubes had imploded, circuit boards had cracked, and the improvised antenna system had been vaporized by the first shell impact that struck directly above the bunker entrance. But Tommy could still hear fragments of radio transmissions through the static of a damaged receiver that was running on backup battery power and picking up signals from multiple frequencies simultaneously. The reception was intermittent and distorted, but clear enough for Tommy to recognize voices and understand the tactical situation that was developing above ground. Fire Direction Center, this is Charlie Company. That was right on target. German armor is destroyed and enemy infantry is retreating. Outstanding fire mission, tell that radio operator he just saved 60 American lives. Charlie Company is moving to secure the area and continue the advance. Mike's voice, filled with relief and tactical satisfaction, reporting that the artillery fire had achieved its mission and that his company was safe from the German armor that had been threatening to overrun their position. Tommy had succeeded in saving his brother's life and the lives of 60 American soldiers, but he was now trapped underground with no communication equipment and no way to signal that he had survived the bombardment he had called down on himself. Mike's voice, filled with relief and tactical satisfaction, reporting that the artillery fire had achieved its mission and that his company was safe. Tommy had succeeded in saving his brother's life and the lives of 60 American soldiers, but he was now trapped underground with no communication equipment and no way to signal that he had survived the bombardment. Tommy tried to move toward the bunker's entrance but found his path blocked by debris that had fallen during the bombardment. The concrete stairs leading to the surface were partially collapsed, and the steel door at the top was jammed shut by twisted metal and fallen timber from the forest above. Tommy was buried alive in a tomb of his own making, surrounded by the destruction he had called down on himself to save his brother. The irony was perfect and bitter. He had survived the artillery bombardment that was supposed to kill him, but he was trapped in a position where rescue was impossible and slow death from thirst and oxygen deprivation was inevitable. Tommy sat down beside his destroyed radio equipment and began to laugh, not from humor but from the psychological stress of realizing that he had outsmarted himself. He had found a way to survive calling artillery fire on his own position, but he had also ensured that no one would ever find him alive. That's when Tommy heard Mike's voice again, much closer than before, coming through the wreckage above the bunker. "Tommy. Tommy, if you're down there, make some noise. We know you called in that fire mission from somewhere around here. The rescue that proved everything." Mike's search for his brother began 30 minutes after the artillery bombardment ended, when Charlie Company advanced through the devastated German positions and found evidence that someone had been operating a radio from the area that had been saturated with American artillery fire. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling to someone who knew Tommy's operating methods as well as Mike did. German telephone wire that had been modified into a makeshift radio antenna was scattered among the debris, showing the kind of technical improvisation that was Tommy's signature. American radio equipment fragments were embedded in tree bark and scattered among the German defensive positions, indicating that sophisticated communication equipment had been operating from this location during the bombardment. But most importantly, the tactical precision of the artillery fire that had saved Charlie Company could only have been directed by someone with a clear view of the target area and intimate knowledge of American artillery procedures. The coordinates had been perfect, the timing had been ideal, and the fire control had shown the kind of professional expertise that only an experienced radio operator could provide under extreme combat conditions. Mike knew his brother's personality and methods well enough to recognize Tommy's signature in every aspect of the fire mission. The willingness to accept personal risk to protect others, the technical expertise to maintain communication with damaged equipment, and the tactical precision to direct artillery fire under impossible conditions, these were all characteristics that marked the fire mission as Tommy's work. Mike began his systematic search by examining the German bunker complex that had survived the artillery bombardment, looking for signs that someone might have taken shelter in the underground positions during the devastating fire mission. The main bunker showed clear evidence of recent American occupation: cigarette butts from American tobacco brands scattered near the entrance, food wrappers from American care rations that had been discarded in the corner, and most importantly, fragments of American radio equipment that had been damaged by the concussion of artillery impacts. The bunker's entrance was blocked by fallen timber and twisted metal debris that had been blown into the opening by the force of nearby shell impacts. But Mike could see that the blockage was recent, caused by the artillery bombardment rather than previous combat damage, which suggested that someone might have been trapped inside when the debris sealed the entrance. "Tommy!" Mike shouted into the bunker entrance that was blocked by debris and twisted metal. "Tommy, if you're down there, bang on something metal. Use the emergency signals we practiced as kids." The response was immediate and unmistakable. The rhythmic tapping of metal on metal that spelled out, "Mike," in Morse code, repeated 3 times to ensure recognition through the debris that was blocking direct communication. Tommy was alive, trapped in the bunker, but able to communicate using the emergency signaling methods they had learned as children when playing war games in the Irish neighborhoods of Boston. The sound was coming from deep within the bunker complex, indicating that Tommy was trapped in one of the lower levels that had been sealed by debris when the artillery bombardment collapsed part of the entrance structure. Mike could hear the tapping clearly, but he could also tell that the sound was muffled by considerable debris that would require careful removal to avoid causing additional structural collapse. Mike organized a rescue operation using explosive charges to clear the blocked entrance and heavy equipment to lift the debris that was preventing access to the underground bunker. The work was dangerous and time-consuming, requiring careful placement of charges to blast away the largest obstacles while avoiding damage to the structural supports that were keeping the bunker entrance from complete collapse. The rescue team included combat engineers who understood demolitions work and construction techniques that could safely remove debris without causing additional cave-ins. The engineers used small-shaped charges to break up the largest pieces of concrete and steel, followed by manual excavation using hand tools and ropes to remove smaller debris that was blocking access to the bunker interior. The breakthrough came after 3 hours of careful excavation, when Mike's demolition team managed to clear enough debris to create a narrow passage into the bunker where Tommy had been trapped since the artillery bombardment. The opening was barely wide enough for a single person to crawl through, and it required careful navigation around sharp metal fragments and unstable concrete that could shift and trap anyone attempting passage. Mike was the first person through the opening, crawling through fallen concrete and twisted steel to reach his brother in the underground chamber where Tommy had survived one of the most intense artillery bombardments of the European War. The passage was claustrophobic and dangerous, requiring Mike to squeeze through spaces that were barely large enough for human passage while avoiding sharp edges that could cause serious injury. Tommy was conscious but exhausted, sitting beside the destroyed radio equipment that had saved 60 American lives at the cost of his own freedom. When Mike reached him, Tommy's first words were characteristic of his personality and his priorities. "Did the fire mission work? Is Charlie Company safe?" "Charlie Company is safe," Mike replied, helping Tommy toward the narrow opening that led to the surface. 60 American soldiers are alive because you decided to call artillery fire on your own position. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen, or the stupidest. Both, Tommy answered, accepting Mike's help to climb through the debris toward daylight and freedom. But you would have done the same thing if our positions had been reversed. Mike knew that Tommy was right. The bonds of brotherhood and the responsibilities of military service had created a situation where both brothers would have made the same choice, accepting personal risk to protect the people they loved and the soldiers they were sworn to serve. Tommy emerged from the bunker at 1,547 hours, 3 hours after calling artillery fire on his own position and 2 hours after being declared missing in action by his commanding officer. His survival was unprecedented in the experience of the artillery units that had conducted the fire mission, and his tactical decision became a case study that was analyzed throughout the American artillery community. The technique that changed doctrine. Tommy Callahan's decision to call artillery fire on his own position while trapped in enemy territory became one of the most analyzed tactical decisions of World War II, but its significance extended far beyond the immediate success of the fire mission that saved Charlie Company. Tommy had demonstrated that effective artillery coordination could be maintained even under conditions that appeared to make communication impossible, and that individual radio operators could make tactical decisions that had strategic impact when conventional command structures were disrupted by enemy action. His willingness to accept personal risk to achieve tactical objectives established new precedents for the role of communications personnel in combat operations. The precision of Tommy's fire mission, delivered with damaged equipment from a position that was under direct attack, proved that properly trained radio operators could function as independent tactical assets rather than simple communication links between commanders and artillery units. This realization led to enhanced training programs that emphasized individual initiative and technical innovation for communications specialists. Tommy's survival of direct artillery bombardment in a German bunker provided valuable intelligence about enemy construction techniques and defensive capabilities that influenced American tactical doctrine for subsequent operations in heavily fortified areas. The structural analysis of the bunker where Tommy had taken shelter led to improved understanding of German engineering practices and more effective tactics for attacking similar fortifications. The psychological impact of Tommy's decision was equally important for American military morale and tactical thinking. The knowledge that individual soldiers were willing to risk their lives to protect their comrades, even when it meant calling artillery fire on their own positions, demonstrated the kind of unit cohesion and personal courage that made American forces effective against determined enemy resistance. But perhaps most importantly, Tommy's willingness to accept personal risk to protect his brother's unit demonstrated the kind of individual initiative and family loyalty that made American forces effective in situations where conventional military training and equipment were inadequate. His story became a model for the type of creative problem-solving and personal sacrifice that characterized American military effectiveness throughout the war. After the war, Tommy remained in the Army and eventually achieved the rank of Master Sergeant, serving as a communications instructor who trained the next generation of radio operators in advanced techniques for maintaining contact under extreme conditions. Tommy's combat experience made him one of the most respected voices in the development of field communication procedures during the early years of the Cold War. Tommy's training methods emphasized the importance of improvisation and individual initiative that could maintain critical communications when conventional systems failed. His students learned not just technical procedures for operating radio equipment, but the kind of creative thinking and personal courage that might be necessary when standard methods were inadequate for emergency situations. The curriculum that Tommy developed for advanced communications training included detailed case studies of his own fire mission, but with careful attention to the exceptional circumstances that had made such a drastic measure necessary. Students learned about the technical challenges of maintaining communication with damaged equipment, the tactical considerations involved in directing artillery fire from forward positions, and the personal decision-making process that had led to Tommy's choice to risk his own life. Mike also remained in military service, transitioning from infantry to special forces and eventually commanding airborne units during the Korean War and early phases of the Vietnam conflict. Mike's experience as an infantry commander who had been saved by his brother's sacrifice made him particularly sensitive to the importance of reliable communications and the individual courage required from support personnel in combat operations. Mike's leadership style was heavily influenced by his understanding of the relationship between individual sacrifice and unit effectiveness. He demanded the highest standards of technical competence and personal courage from his communications personnel, but he also ensured that they understood the tactical importance of their role and the impact that their decisions could have on the survival of combat units. The Callahan brothers never served together again after the Hurtgen Forest, but their wartime experience created a bond that influenced both of their military careers and their understanding of the relationship between personal loyalty and professional duty. They maintained regular correspondence throughout their continued military service, sharing tactical innovations and training methods that were informed by their shared experience of ultimate sacrifice and salvation. Tommy received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the artillery fire mission, with a citation that praised his extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for personal safety in the performance of duty under extreme combat conditions. But Tommy always said that the real reward was knowing that Mike had survived the war and that their father would have been proud of both his sons. Mike received the Silver Star for his leadership during the German counterattack and his subsequent rescue operation that saved Tommy's life. The citation recognized his exceptional courage and tactical innovation in the face of overwhelming enemy forces, but Mike's greatest satisfaction came from knowing that he had repaid his brother's sacrifice with his own willingness to risk everything for family. The legacy that outlasted the war. The story of Tommy Callahan's artillery fire mission became one of the most celebrated examples of individual heroism and family loyalty in the history of American artillery forces, but its significance extended far beyond the tactical success of a single engagement. Tommy had proven that love for family could provide the motivation to attempt actions that training and doctrine declared impossible, and that the bonds between brothers could overcome the natural human instinct for self-preservation when the stakes were high enough. The relationship between Tommy and Mike Callahan after the war illustrated how shared extreme experiences could strengthen family bonds and create mutual understanding that lasted for decades. Mike understood that Tommy had risked everything to save Charlie Company, accepting probable death to protect his brother and 60 other soldiers. Tommy understood that Mike's rescue operation had required the same kind of courage and family loyalty that had motivated the original artillery fire mission. After their military careers ended, Tommy and Mike established a communications consulting business that specialized in emergency communication systems for police and fire departments. The business became known for its emphasis on reliability and individual initiative that could maintain critical communications when conventional systems failed. Tommy's artillery fire mission was taught as part of the advanced curriculum at the Army's Artillery School, but with careful attention to the exceptional circumstances that had made such a drastic measure necessary. Students learned not just how to coordinate fire support under extreme conditions, but when it might be necessary to risk everything to protect others. The Callahan brothers' story became an example of how family loyalty could provide motivation for extraordinary achievements under impossible conditions. Their experience proved that the bonds between brothers could overcome fear, regulations, and self-preservation when someone you cared about was depending on your willingness to attempt the impossible. Perhaps most importantly, Tommy and Mike's story demonstrated that heroism often came not from people who were naturally fearless, but from people who were willing to overcome their fear when the alternative was watching family members die while they stood by helplessly. During the Korean War, several American radio operators used Tommy's techniques to call artillery fire on their own positions when overrun by enemy forces, saving numerous infantry units at the cost of their own lives. Tommy's tactical innovation had become part of the unofficial doctrine that guided communications personnel in extreme situations. The bunker where Tommy had survived the artillery bombardment was preserved by the German government as part of a battlefield memorial that honored both German and American soldiers who died in the Hurtgen forest. A small plaque near the bunker entrance reads, "Here an American radio operator called artillery fire on his own position to save his brother's unit. Courage has no nationality." But for Tommy and Mike Callahan, the most important recognition was the knowledge that they had lived up to their father's expectations and the values he had taught them about family loyalty and mutual protection. They had proven that the bonds of brotherhood could overcome any obstacle when the people you loved were depending on your courage. The enduring power of sacrifice and salvation. The broader significance of Tommy Callahan's story extends beyond military history to fundamental questions about courage, family loyalty, and the relationship between personal risk and moral responsibility. Tommy had demonstrated that the most heroic actions often came from people who were faced with impossible choices and chose to prioritize the welfare of others over their own survival. Tommy's decision to call artillery fire on his own position wasn't tactical brilliance or adherence to military doctrine. It was pure emotional motivation driven by love for his brother and responsibility for fellow soldiers. The combination of family bonds and professional duty created conditions where conventional thinking gave way to extraordinary action that achieved what careful planning and adequate resources might not have accomplished. The principles Tommy applied, accepting personal risk to protect others, using damaged equipment beyond its intended limitations, and refusing to accept that some situations were hopeless when family was involved, proved relevant to many situations beyond military combat. His story became a model for how individual determination and self-sacrifice could achieve results that formal procedures and adequate preparation had failed to accomplish. Perhaps most importantly, Tommy Callahan had shown that the most powerful motivations for heroic action came not from abstract ideals about duty and honor, but from specific love for particular people who were counting on you to find a way to save them when conventional approaches weren't sufficient. The relationship between Tommy and Mike illustrated how family bonds could provide the emotional strength necessary for extraordinary achievements under extreme stress. Tommy's love for his brother enabled him to attempt something that training and equipment alone could never have motivated, while Mike's determination to rescue Tommy demonstrated the same kind of family loyalty that had inspired the original sacrifice. So here's the question Tommy's story poses. What would you be willing to risk if someone you loved was in mortal danger and you were the only person in position to help them? How far beyond normal safety limits could you push yourself if failure meant losing the person who mattered most to you? And what sacrifices might be justified when the alternative is accepting loss that's unacceptable because it involves family? Tommy Callahan proved that sometimes the most important communications don't involve words at all, but actions that demonstrate the depth of love and loyalty that exists between people who are willing to risk everything for each other when the stakes are highest and conventional solutions aren't adequate to protect the people who matter most.